Hello, my name is Douglas Arner, and welcome to this month's episode of Looking Back, Looking Forward. My colleagues and I are very frequently asked, how can governments around the world support the development of FinTech, of digital finance? And I think at this stage it's useful to summarize what we've learned so far. And I think we've highlighted that three areas are the key focus. The first is the underlying infrastructure. It is the infrastructure that supports a digital financial ecosystem. The second is on regulatory approaches to FinTech in particular and innovation more broadly. And the third is in the context of the wider ecosystem. And we'll be looking at each of these in more detail as we go forward over the coming months. We think about the infrastructure. The infrastructure really has four key elements. The first is essentially mobile penetration, the availability of mobile phones, smartphones, mobile internet. And this is really a core strategy everywhere. And what we've seen is the mobile phone is probably the most powerful piece of technology to support human and sustainable development ever developed so far. The second, very much around sovereign digital biometric identification systems. The third, around interoperable electronic payment systems. And these pieces used together to get widespread access to accounts, either bank accounts, mobile money accounts, electronic wallets, to the population at large. These pieces can in turn be used for the third, which is provision of government services. And importantly, these foundational infrastructures also dramatically reduce the cost of other sorts of new businesses and ideas, setting the foundations for wider development. Second, regulatory approaches. The first is reviewing to make sure that you don't have necessarily any regulatory restrictions that act as an undue barrier. The second is looking to see if you have certain pieces in the context of regulatory requirements, in particular systems around regulating payment systems and well-structured regulatory remits for your central bank and any other financial regulators. Key within these is what we would describe as a proportional regulatory approach. Proportional means that you try to set different sorts of regulatory requirements depending upon the sorts of risks that an institution provides. The smaller, the less significant, the lower the regulatory requirements. As something gets more and more large and significant, higher and higher regulatory requirements to balance the risks that may arise. The third piece is RegTech, the use of technology for regulatory purposes. Using technology for collecting information, for monitoring, for implementing enforcement processes, these are key to regulatory function. And the third is really around thinking through a variety of test and learn approaches. How can regulators work with industry to work together to understand opportunities and risks to build appropriate regulatory frameworks? And that takes us to the wider ecosystem. The first is the wider legal foundations, that there are appropriate places for creditor rights, for property rights, for contract enforcement. These sorts of things very beneficial in supporting FinTech innovation as well as wider development. The second, a very important focus on education, supporting the development of education, particularly younger, but even through university, to support an understanding of digital as well as finance. The third, research and development funding. And I think we're seeing an increasing link between government support, either directly or indirectly, for research and development funding and wider ecosystem development. The final piece is in the context of an integration of an innovation hub and a regulatory sandbox. An innovation hub, we find, plays a particularly important role in that it provides a mechanism so that those coming from the private sector have an easy means to directly communicate with regulators so that both can get a better understanding of possibilities as well as risks. And finally, a sandbox gives a testing environment where new ideas can be tested to develop regulatory approaches. So, when you're thinking about developing a FinTech or an innovation ecosystem, what do you need? Well, you start with a focus on the infrastructure, then you look to appropriate regulatory approaches in the context of a wider ecosystem. Long term, but we know how to do it.